Is your adolescent or child having a hard time sleeping? Are you wondering if there are changes you can make in their daily lifestyle to help optimize their sleep? In today's episode, we're going to talk about the effects of diet on child and adolescent sleep. For those of you who are new to the show, my name is Dr. Blair Rolnick. I'm a board-certified pediatrician and mom myself. So let's dive right in.
Welcome to the Beehive Doc Talks with Dr. Blair Rolnick. As a pediatrician and mother herself, Dr. Rolnick is here to answer your most pressing parenting questions and guide you through the tough spots.
I want to focus today specifically on one aspect of our children's diets, and that is processed foods versus whole foods. In order to do that, let's take a step back and talk about what are the differences between processed and whole foods, and what does that really mean? You might read a lot in the news headlines about ultra-processed foods and their effect on our health, but what we don't talk about a lot to parents is what we mean by ultra-processed and what we mean by whole foods. It might seem silly, but let's just break that down a little bit. So a whole food is generally food the way that it comes out of the ground or the way that it exists naturally in the world or environment. So for example, a whole food would be a whole apple in its intact form, or a broccoli floret the way that it comes out of the ground. Slightly processed foods means that you take a whole food and alter it just a little bit, maybe by adding sugar or salt, or removing the skin by peeling it or cutting it. So something that is minimally processed, for example, might be apple slices that have been peeled, decored, and sliced up. A slightly more processed version of an apple might be taking that apple, slicing it, peeling it, adding some sugar, boiling it, and mashing it. When you look at something like that, which is basically the starting ingredients to homemade applesauce, that applesauce doesn't really look a lot like an apple looks like in the natural world. So processing just means taking something in its whole natural form and slowly changing it. The less that it looks like the way it looks in nature, the more processed it is. So to go back to the apple example, apple juice does not really represent an apple at all, and it comes very far away from what the apple naturally looks like. Some juices, for example, are not even made from apples. They're made from apple abstract or artificial apple flavor, and so that would then become an ultra-processed food, or an example of an ultra-processed food. Here in the United States specifically, we are trending more towards processed diets and away from whole foods, mostly because they are more convenient and they last longer. Particularly, we've seen that trend is more pronounced in our children and adolescents. Recent data shows that most adolescents and children, their diet is somewhere between 30 and 60% from ultra-processed foods. So, what does that have to do with sleep? There is emerging evidence that processed foods do affect our overall sleep architecture and may be correlated with sleep problems. So there was a study published in Nutrition in 2013, which was a meta-analysis, meaning they tried to look at studies across multiple databases to pool the results of those studies to make the findings statistically more significant. And what they found was children and adolescents who consumed ultra-processed foods as a majority of their diet, or even as part of their diet, had worse sleep outcomes compared to those who did not. And it was a correlative effect. So the more processed foods that children eat, the worse the sleep outcomes, which really makes a strong case for a true association between processed foods and poor sleep outcomes. Another study out of China looked at carbonated drinks and ultra-processed foods such as fast foods and its effect on anxiety-induced sleep problems, which I think is particularly interesting in the adolescent population. And what they found were two things. Adolescents who consume fast foods had higher risks of anxiety-induced sleep problems. And then secondly, adolescents who drink carbonated drinks also had increased risk for anxiety-induced sleep problems. Adolescents who drank at least 3 or more carbonated drinks a day, which I think is kind of a lot, had 200% increase in anxiety-induced sleep problems. So what that tells us is there's probably a link between ultra-processed foods and potentially their ingredients and the way that affects our brain and sleep architecture. This isn't the research in ultra-processed foods and its link to behaviors and mental health is emerging, but it has been shown in more than one study to have an effect on certainly adult mental health and behavior, as well as child and adolescent mental health and behavior. So there probably is more than one reason outside of trying to improve or optimize our child's sleep to avoid ultra-processed foods. We talked about in a previous episode, moving to whole food plant-based diets does have a reduction in child hypercholesteremia and dyslipidemia, as well as improved behavioral and sleep outcomes. So if your child is struggling with sleeping through the night or getting consistent 10 to 12 hours of sleep, it's probably worth a try to just be a little bit mindful and focus on their diet a little bit more throughout the day and see if you see any positive associations or changes with that. If you're going to make that kind of change, I would really recommend on focusing on 3 meals a day, which are containing as much as you can whole and minimally processed home-cooked, ideally, foods. It is better, in my opinion, to have a whole homemade meal that is whole food oriented than a meal that is, let's say, organic or non-GMO. There are tons of examples of foods out there that meet the standards of being organic and non-GMO, but are ultra processed. And so it's actually better probably for you and your child to go with a non-organic, non-GMO food if that's not within your means, but still being a whole food. I think, again, it's probably worth your while if you're a parent of a child who's struggling with sleep to try to make this change in their diet and see if you notice any positive feedback from doing so. I hope that you find this information helpful. If you have any questions or comments, as always, please leave them below. If you've had an experience with your child having sleep problems and made kind of some of these dietary changes and had any results, please share that with the community. That's always helpful information for other parents out there going through a similar situation.
Thank you for watching The Beehive Doc Talks with Dr. Blair Rolnick. For more episodes and her practice, visit BeKindPediatrics.com and don't forget to subscribe for more parenting tips wherever you get your podcasts. This information is for educational purposes only. It is not medical advice. Always seek medical advice from a qualified physician.